Okay, and welcome back to another chapter of Mr. Hamilton teaching AP Environmental Science. We're going to continue with our discussions on biodiversity, but this time spend more of our thought process on wildlife populations and their interaction with their ecosystem. So we're going to move on to have some fun here and hopefully learn a little bit more about a species and how it interacts. What exactly makes a species is just a quick review for you. Remember that a species is morphologically different from another particular species. It has a different phenotype. It also has a different genotype. And it also reproduces in isolation. It cannot reproduce with another species. So, exactly how many species are there on our planet? Well, we have documented and we do know of about 1.4 to 1.5 million different species, but scientists have gotten real good at estimating the total number of species, and we narrowed that range down to a range of somewhere between 5 and 50 million species on the planet. We're not sure exactly how many, but it's somewhere in that range. So we got it narrowed down pretty good. But if you look at the total number of species, and in your notes you have this chart, you will see that our world is dominated not by what you think, okay? But if you look at the total number, we have a world dominated by insects. Of the 1.4 million documented species, about half are insects. And then if you look at the next highest category, you're talking about plants. At around 250,000 are plants. So you can see our world is really insect dominated. But at the same time, we have a lot of plants as well. And if you look at what we're familiar with, which would be the mammals, look at the total number of mammals on our planet in number of species. There are about 4,000. Nowhere near the number of species as we have in the other categories. And so, in fact, if you look at mammals and compare it to others, you'd be quite surprised. If you look on this chart, there are just as many sponges. There are actually more sponges on our planet, or species of sponges on our planet, than there are mammals. And so when you think about mammals being very diverse and a huge number, you're talking about a very, very small fraction of the total number of species on our planet. Now, these species, of all of them, seem to be concentrated in certain areas on the Earth. So we call these biodiversity hotspots. And the hotspots are places on our Earth in which the biodiversity is at its greatest, and these hotspots are designated by an organization called Conservation International as the most important places to protect on our planet because of their diversity in the species. So we have a bunch of biodiversity hotspots around the globe, and if you look, most of them are found in tropical rainforest regions, as well as in various specific habitats. Now, with these biodiversity hotspots, we have to look at the species being, if I can write, what we call endemic species. And these endemic species are species that live in a small area and nowhere else in the world. So they live in a small area and nowhere else in the world, and they're given the name endemic. And so these particular hotspots are very important because of their high number of endemic species. And one of the great examples is the Hawaiian Islands, where you have certain species that live in Hawaiian Islands that live nowhere else. And so therefore, in order to protect biodiversity, you've got to protect those islands. So great example of this, if I can spell the Hawaiian Islands, and don't laugh if I spell it wrong. I think it's 2 I's, and we're going to try it. All right, but anyway, these are the places. I mean, the Hawaiian Islands represented right there with that flag. And just to give you an example of how biodiversity places are, of the Conservation International's 34 biodiversity hotspots on this planet, they represent only 2.3% of all of the land on the earth, okay, but represent 50% of all plant species, okay, and about 42%, somewhere around 42% of all the vertebrate species. So in 2.3% of the earth, we find half of the plants and almost half of all of the vertebrates. And so therefore these places, these biodiversity hotspots, are so important. All right. And as we go through preserving, how to preserve the Earth's ecosystems and biomes, we'll be talking about biodiversity hotspots a lot in the future. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is species fitness. This idea that was put forth by Charles Darwin about the fitness of a species. And when we talk about fitness, we're actually talking about the ability of a species, the ability to do two things: to reproduce and to survive. So the fitness is its ability to reproduce, survive, and it's not this idea of survival of the fittest, meaning strongest, but rather the survival of the ability to reproduce and survive in their ecosystem. And when Darwin was on the Galapagos Islands and he noticed this incredible idea, or he came up with this incredible idea through his observations, he decided that this idea of fitness was the most important thing. And he found out this, or he came up with this idea by coming and looking and observing and noticed certain things. Number one, the thing that he noticed, okay, these are Darwin's observations. He noticed one very, very important thing, and that was that species produce an excess of offspring. And he questioned why. Why would a species use the energy to produce a large number of offspring? And that his next observation was that not all of them survived. And the idea that they don't all survive gave him the idea that the offspring's difference in traits that were passed on from the parent to the offspring was the one factor that determined whether they're going to survive or not. Okay, so that his idea was that the traits that were associated, that were passed down from the parent, that these traits was what made the offspring different from each other, which helped them survive. Certain ones survive. So the traits helped the species to survive, or the individuals to survive, and that these traits were the important factor. And therefore he came up with this idea that you had to have the right traits in order to survive. And those traits are given a name. And I think we all know the basics behind this, but the traits are known as adaptations. Okay? And these adaptations are what help a species reproduce and survive. Now, what are the life functions or the purpose of these adaptations? Well, they're designed to do four things. And what we're going to talk about are basically four things. All right. The number one thing that these traits help a species, and that is to reproduce, which I think is quite obvious. But the second is the survival part. Okay. It could be something like avoiding predators. All right. So that you could have mimicry, or shall we say camouflage, or speed, agility, the ability to fly. These things to are created to avoid predators. Okay. Also, number 3 would be to obtain energy. All species need to obtain energy, whether it's an animal, and this is ability to eat, all right, like a predator, or it could be a plant whose adaptation is to find sunlight. Okay, so it may grow taller, or maybe a vine to get to the sunlight. So these adaptations are created through these traits, according to Darwin, through these traits, all right, passed on from the parents to the offspring, and it helps them survive by enabling them to do these different things. And the final one is to adapt, if you want to call that, adapt, whoops, sorry about that, to their climate and the other limiting factors. So when we talk about these adaptations, we're talking about adapting to climate. So in other words, fur to stay warm. Okay, the ability to have cold-blooded, where you go out into the sun and sun themselves. These types of things help them survive in their climates. Okay, with those particular limiting factors. Okay, so those are the purposes of these adaptations, and I think it gives us a good perspective on how wildlife is adapted. All right. And this is the Galapagos Islands, and with all these unique species, these endemic species that are found only here, all right, on the Galapagos Islands. And this is where he became famous, even though he was not the only one. There were actually 2, Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, independently created this idea of what we call evolution today, and the process of natural selection in creating these changes in the species. Okay, now as we move on, we're going to talk about microevolution in this case. We're going to start with that. So we're going to start off with something called microevolution. All right, and we talk about microevolution. What we're talking about is through the process of some sort of pressure on the environment, on species, that there is a change within the genetic material of a species, okay, that caused the species to differ. All right, so when we talk about microevolution, we're talking about evolution that occurs on a species level. All right, such as the creation of different varieties of apples, I don't know, or the different colors of a bird. All right, so microevolution is within a species, or the evolution of traits at a species level. That's the best way that I can put it. I call that a species level. Okay? And we're going to look at that with an example of how this actually works, and how these adaptations are created and become part of the genetic material for future generations of that particular species.